Okay, so just a quick introduction about who I am. I work in the computer vision lab with Tony Pridmore and Andy French. I did my PhD under the supervision of Tony, and I've worked for quite a few years now between computer science and the School of Biosciences doing image analysis for plant phenotyping. So you'll have seen, some of my stuff perhaps turning up from here and there. And just in the last couple of years, we've really shifted our focus towards deep learning. And I, in particular, have been doing quite a lot of really applied deep learning stuff on plants. So that's, basically an introduction of who we are. Today I'm going to talk about, hopefully try and explain what deep learning actually is, because, of course, it's all over the media, but they never explain it because most of them, I guess, haven't looked into it. How are we using deep learning? What am I doing specifically with deep learning in crops? And what do I think it means for everyone else, right? So how can we leverage this new revolution in plant phenotyping for basically better, global food security and better crop phenotyping in particular? So I'll basically talk a bit about the projects that I've been involved with doing plant phenotyping using deep learning, and also an explanation of what it is, so that you could sort of hopefully see how it might fit into what you're doing, at your labs. Okay, so this slide is unnecessary, right? Given who I'm talking to, but I see image analysis as a thing that facilitates phenotyping. Particularly by making it high throughput, right? So not everything is high throughput. Lots of my tools are semi-automatic, but basically to try and make it faster for a user and a biologist to perform, a lot of experiments quickly. We also want it to be as automatic as we can and objective. Objective is important, especially if you've got multiple people involved in a research project. People might have different approaches to things, whereas an algorithm just has one very straight approach, which I quite like. Okay, so, I won't go into any more detail than that. This is something, I think we're all agreed on. So what I do, I think, to explain deep learning is perhaps look at an example of some software I wrote, and then how I might use deep learning to essentially improve it. And then, in doing so, hopefully, you can see what it is that deep learning offers. So back in 2014, a few years into my postdoc, I wrote a tool called RootNav. Right? Now, some of you may have used RootNav, you may not, but basically it is a two-dimensional image analysis tool that operates on images that look broadly like these ones here, these ones over here. So we have a system where we're growing wheat seedlings on this blue growth paper, which is dipped in growth medium, and essentially what I wanted to do was extract as much of these architectures as possible automatically. And the primary focus in this particular piece of software is accuracy. So this is not quite like some of the automated systems like EasyRiser and WinRiso, which will produce general statistics very, very quickly, but some of them, might make assumptions. This one allows a user to intervene and try and really improve accuracy. So while I was developing RootNav, what I wanted to do was find paths, much like a sat-nav does, between the seed, which is sort of this location over here, and all of the tips in the image, so here, 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 and so on. Now, the problem I had was I attempted to program up an automated tip detector, which would reliably start this seeding process, as it were, and find all these paths, and basically hit a lot of hurdles, because actually what looks to be a very, very straightforward problem is actually quite difficult. So in the end, we settled on RootNav being a semi-automatic tool, where a user would click on the seed and click on the tips, and then the paths would be found automatically. So it's still faster than manually tracing, but it's significantly slower than if we were automatically finding tips. Now, I did, at the time, attempt to find tips, and what I used was something called a Harris corner detector. So you can see the results on the right-hand side. A Harris corner detector is basically a very low-level image feature that essentially finds anything that looks a little bit like a corner. And suffice to say, it didn't work because there's a lot of them, right? You can see that actually it has found quite a lot of the tips, but it's also found a great deal of other stuff, which of course is completely useless for an automatic system. If I wanted to automate this process, we're really looking at 90, 95, 98 you know, and higher % accuracy, because otherwise we're just going to have too many cumulative errors. So it was okay, but it was not great. And even with a bit of post-processing on these features, I was maybe able to get to 60 or 70% accuracy. And I realized that if I wanted to get any better than that, I was going to have to spend months and months and months trying to program in edge cases and essentially wasting time, and I would never get it that good, right? Especially because someone would come along with a slightly different image and it wouldn't work at all. So the problem with me picking low-level image features is that they're not very general, right? I could pick image features that might find the tips of this plant in the top right, but they probably wouldn't work on this plant in the bottom right because it's a wheat plant, not a rice plant, and it's in a completely different location. So it's not a general approach. I can spend a long time handcrafting these features and obtain actually not very good results, and it will be hard to move it over to other kinds of images. That was what we were struggling with. So machine learning offers a slightly better approach. The idea that we can try and teach a machine to use features in perhaps a more complicated and automatic way than I could do. So we want to train a machine or some software to recognize patterns of data. Now, what those patterns are is going to depend on your specific requirements. But in this case, I thought, well, let's try and classify root tips. If I can look at a small section of image and decide with very high accuracy whether that image is a root tip, then I am a long way towards solving my RootNav problem. Because I can essentially look over an image, split it up into lots of small sections, and find out where all the tips are. So what I want to do is train a machine to look at this image on the left, which is a small, I think it's 32 by 32 pixel image of what actually isn't a root tip, and tell me whether it is or not. Right. So the traditional machine learning approach is we find some representation of this image using features, and then we train a neural network or support vector machine or some machine learning approach to solve this problem for us. And we throw a lot of information at it, a lot of data, loads and loads of images, and eventually it will work out what patterns to look for and will actually do quite well. So this is in essence the traditional machine learning approach, or what we might call, if we were being a little bit mean, shallow learning. So I have my input image. Now, often input images, even this one, are quite big compared to what a neural network wants to use. So what we tend to do is simplify this image into features. So in this case, I've used histogram of orientated gradients features, so HOG features, which were very popular about 10 years ago. And what they do is highlight the dominant angles at every position in the image. So if you look at this image here, which is a visualization of the HOG features, you can see that here, for example, the dominant angles are straight up and down, and here they're kind of all over, because basically this is noise. Now, I guess my hypothesis in this case is that by simplifying this image to HOG features, I'm essentially distilling the information in this image into a way that we can use a classifier to determine whether there's a root tip. And we also reduce the amount of data we're giving to the classifier. So these HOG features are actually just numbers, and we put them out into a big long list, and then we train a neural network or support vector machine to essentially classify this list. Given these numbers here, is it a root tip or is it not? Given a different set of numbers, is it a root tip or is it not? And then we train our machine to predict that for us. So, hang on, bear with me. There we go. So this is where our neural network would fit. We wouldn't put the neural network usually directly on the image and have it learn from the image. We would calculate some intermediate features and then have our neural network learn it. Okay, so that's broadly speaking what traditional machine learning does. Now, so just a brief background on, I'm getting a pop-up that's saying allow viewer 26 to present. I don't think I want to do that. Let me know if I do need to. So just a bit of a brief background then about neural networks, right? So think back to this image here. If I go back one, maybe if I can. There we go. The neural network is taking this list of numbers and it's producing a 1 or 0, a root tip or not a root tip. Right? So what a neural network does is it has numerous layers. The input is our feature vector, and the output is our classification, so 1 or 0. Right? And you can have multiple outputs if your neural network is doing something more complicated. Now, although people argue that a neural network is in some way inspired by the brain, I mean, we're talking very loosely inspired by the brain. Right? So neurons in an artificial neural network work in a kind of similar way intuitively, but really it's not a lot like our brain. So it's actually just a weighted sum of all our inputs. So this neuron here that I'm pointing, I'm hoping you can see my mouse pointer. This neuron here is taking a weighted sum of all 4 of these inputs. So that is, it's taking some amount of this one, plus some amount of this one, plus some amount of this one and this one, right? And calculating a final value for itself. This second one will be calculating a very similar sum, but with different weights. So these arrows here represent the weights of our neural network. So you can imagine that this one might have a high result when input 1 is high, but this one might have a high result when inputs 3 and 4 are high, or something like this. The idea being that we are abstracting away from our input. Instead of learning a representation just of our input, we're trying to kind of calculate a bunch of intermediate values which are useful, and then use those to calculate another weighted sum that produces our output. Now, this is just one hidden layer. A neural network could have, a few hidden layers if you wanted, and you can imagine that the more hidden layers you create, the deeper your representation is, and the more sort of hierarchy we can get in our representation. So, for example, if this is just a combination of inputs, and this is a different combination of inputs, then this one here is an interesting combination of different combinations of inputs, if that makes sense. So every layer that we adds another layer of sort of complex logic that we can learn. That's what a neural network does. Now, how we actually teach this is we put input in here, and we work out what the actual output is for a network, and then we change all of these weights in the middle to try and improve our output. And we do that repeatedly for lots and lots of input-output pairs. And we keep going until our network settles on something that actually solves our problem. So neural networks work quite well. I mean, during the 80s and 90s, there was a big push towards artificial neural networks, and everyone was very excited. But the problem was that their performance plateaued somewhat. And part of the reason for this was that this neural network is still at the mercy of what inputs I've given it. So if my hog features aren't a very good representation of my roots, then this neural network isn't going to do a very good job. And it isn't really the fault of the neural network. It's more that I've given it poor data. So there's an inherent problem where I'm the one that's picking features to put into the neural network because I might pick bad features, right? Maybe hog isn't good, for my task. And if hog is good for one task, it might not be good for a different task. So a shallow network like this will work very well if you have good inputs that you can do to predict outputs. But in sort of unstructured problems where we don't really know what our inputs should be, it becomes very problematic. This is an example using my RootNav problem. So the hog features of these two images would be almost identical, right? Except that this image here actually has a tip just here, and this one is a crossover, right? So this is an extreme example of a really difficult image, but this is the kind of reason why artificial networks on their own don't solve the problem, because you're always going to find edge cases like this where basically in the feature set that I chose, both these images look exactly the same, and that's a huge issue. So how do we deal with it? Well, this is where deep learning comes in, and this is really where in the last few years everything has changed in terms of what we can and can't do. Now we no longer choose maybe hog features or sift features or edge detection as our input to our network. All we do is we create a much larger network that directly sits on the image and learns everything. So it doesn't just learn how to classify root tips, it also learns what features it needs to do that best. So if it needs to do edge detection, it will do that. If it needs to calculate the horizontal areas, it will do that. It can do all of these things at once and take a combination of them and decide whether it's a root tip or not. And so this is often called representation learning, and the idea is that we're not just learning how to make a decision, we're also learning how to alter this input image into a representation that best places us to make that decision. Right, that's what we're doing. Now, I'll go into a little bit more detail about deep networks rather than just showing this abstract cloud. But in essence, that's the difference between deep learning and shallow learning. Now, what this leaves us with is this idea of more and more data. So deep learning, the deeper your network is, the more parameters you have to learn, the more neurons you're trying to train up, and essentially the more data you need. Right? So deep learning, generally speaking, takes more data than normal shallow learning applications. But with the advantage that the more data we add, the better it gets, usually. So this is a graph by Andrew Ng, who is a kind of one of the leaders in machine learning in the world. He offers a very good Coursera course on machine learning if you're interested. And the idea being that artificial neural networks and standard shallow learning algorithms, as you add data, will eventually plateau out. They won't get any better because our representations that we've chosen to give them are as good as they're going to get, and they stay like that. I can, for example, show my shallow neural network more and more images of root tips, but after a while it will plateau out and not get any better. But deep learning, because it learns better and better representations of features as well, essentially is much less constrained. We put a much deeper network on, and then we just keep giving it more and more data, and the more data it sees, the better it will get. Right? And deep learning is powering all kinds of things, not just plant science. So you can see deep learning basically every time you switch on any kind of media, they're always talking about it. AlphaGo, the Google Mind project that beat expert Korean players at Go, was a deep network. And Tesla auto-driving cars, that's a deep network as well, of the same type I'm about to talk about. So these things are hugely generally applicable, and all you have to do is choose your data wisely. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the difference between what a convolutional neural network is and a shallow neural network. Because when we talk about deep learning, actually, a lot of the time we're talking about convolutional neural networks, which are a specific branch. There are others. A convolution is a small filtering operation that is passed over an image, essentially. It's basically what happens when you multiply this image here with this kernel over here. So a kernel is usually a small window with some values in it, and for every pixel in this input image, we sum up the pixels underlying this kernel and output them in here. So for example, if we're over here, we'll look, if we're centered around this pixel, we'll take the pixel above and to the left and multiply it by -1, and the pixel above and multiply it by 0, and the pixel above and to the right and multiply it by 1. And over this small 3x3 window of input image, we'll calculate a weighted sum of the pixels. Now, in this case, this particular kernel calculates an edge detection for vertical edges, because essentially what we're doing is we're finding bits where this side of the image is different to this side. And you can see the output here. So we have a normal image of a bike, and then we pass this kernel over it, and it turns it into this image here, where white lines represent our left edges, and black lines represent our right edges. Right? So you can see that just with one filtering operation using this kernel, we've completely transformed this image into something new that gives us some useful information on where the edges are. Now, if we rotated this kernel, what we would be doing is finding all the horizontal edges. Okay? And you can imagine perhaps that if we found a way of training a network to alter these weights, it would be able to do its own filtering as it sees necessary to solve whatever problem we give it. Right? That's what we're doing here. So a convolutional neural network takes normal neurons from a neural network and replaces them with these filtering operations, where all of these values start off at random and then are trained up to perform the task we want. So I'll show you a visual example. Perhaps it'll hopefully make a bit more sense. So this is a convolutional neural network that I use to classify tips of wheat ears. This is just a simple example with a few less layers than I used. But what we have our input image here, okay, and then all the way over on the right-hand side, we have a classification as to whether it's a leaf tip or a leaf base or an ear tip or nothing, and so on. Right? So this section here is actually just a regular neural network as before. Now, we begin by convolving this image with numerous filters, which gives us a sort of stack of filters here, right? The one on the front, you can see, is sort of highlighted the left upper edges of everything. So there and there, you can see. And the ones in behind might be finding corners, and the ones behind might be finding the undersides of things. It's not really important. They're trained to do whatever is necessary. Now, we do repeated convolutions on our data as we go along deeper into the network. So essentially, we take these outputs and we convolve them again, and we convolve them again, and we convolve them again, until we start to build up and transform our image into a set of features we can use to perform our prediction. Right? So you can see that if we look closely, we've started to highlight the wheat ear by the time we get down here. You can see. But all of these things will be looking for different things. Now, occasionally, we will also do something called pooling, which will make these images smaller. So actually, this image here is basically the same as this image, but just shrunk by 50%. So the reason being because basically these networks are very, very memory intensive, and so we have to shrink them down quite a lot. So input images to these networks have to be fairly small to be able to use them effectively. The other thing is that if you shrink the spatial dimension, what you're essentially saying is it doesn't matter where in the image our ear is, as long as it's in there somewhere, right? So it gives them a kind of spatial invariance that we like. So that's really all it is to a convolutional neural network. The idea basically is that we take a standard neural network and we replace our neurons, which would just be normal weighted sums, with these convolution operations. Now, modern neural networks go a little bit further with different types of layers, but really convolutions are the key to how it all works. And this is essentially a 4-layer neural network with maybe, if you count these layers as well, maybe sort of 7 layers. You can expect modern neural networks and convolutional neural networks to be upwards of 500 layers. So they really get very, very deep, and depends on what your task is. But as computers get faster, the scope for deeper architectures and more powerful classification, goes up. Okay, so what I'll do now is talk a bit about what I've been up to with convolutional neural networks, and hopefully from those results you'll be able to see just how powerful they are. Because I find myself constantly surprised by how well they work, essentially. So how does this work? Well, it begins with data. Everything to do with machine learning always begins with data. So here's a tool that I'm using to annotate wheat ears, for example. And all I'm doing is broadly annotating where the wheat ears are. That's, in some sense, one of the time-consuming parts of this, is that we go from trying to develop a tool to developing data which can be used to create a tool using deep learning. We then design a network architecture, which is going to involve things like choosing how many convolutional layers there are, what resolution they are, how deep is the network, and how we're going to perform our training, how many images we're going to put in, this kind of thing. So we design the network architecture, and then we send all of this off to what is hopefully a quite powerful computer with graphics cards in it, and train the network up. So that can take anywhere from a few hours to a few days or weeks, depending on the kind of problem you're trying to solve. This would take about a day, this example. And then hopefully you can test and deploy your network. So you can, in this case, find the wheat ears in the image by basically training the network to reproduce what I did here in the annotation. And then with any luck, once we've got something that works, we can deploy that into some kind of software. This is just a test image. I don't actually have software that does this yet. I'm still working on it. The only thing to say really is that this training and testing is kind of an iterative process. So you might find the first time you do it, it doesn't work because you've set up some parameter wrong, or there's something wrong with your data. So you go back and you try again. It's unusual for you to just create some data, train it, and everything works flat out first time. They're very good, but they do need some care. Okay, so let's have a quick look then at what I've been up to. So I started off by trying to, as in my example earlier, trying to find tips in root images. So I have, my software RootNav has been used for a few years now in our lab, and it happens to save all the architectures that they've analysed by hand in the database. So in fact, I have around 2,500 images already annotated by a human user. So extracting annotations is actually already done in some sense. So that first part of the problem is already solved. So I could just create a network and train it on this data. So what I did was I split all of those 2,000 something images into positive and negative examples of root tips. So you can see we've got lots of variants here on, this one here next to another one. Some of them are much more obvious. And then you've got some bits of background and seed and all kinds of things in the negative. So I generated around 45,000 of these from a source of about, let's say, 2,500 input images. And my task was basically, can I train a deep network to take these 32 by 32 pixel crops and reliably split them into these two groups? That's what I was doing. I have another data set of shoots. So I also have done some multi-view reconstruction things in the past, and for that we have about 1,500 images of about 40 plants from different views. So this is just one sample view. This weird target down here is to do with our 3D reconstruction and is essentially not related to what I'm talking about today. I just thought I'd draw attention to it because it's a bit odd looking. So one of the very patient biologists I work with clicked on all the wheat ears and wheat leaf tips and so on in these images over a few days, and then basically sent me all the annotations. And I used that to produce a very similar data set for shoots. So I have ears, tips and bases of ears, bases of leaves, so I've added bases of leaves, tips of leaves, and negative data as well. So anything else, basically. And this was about 60,000 images. I mean, don't be too hung up on the number of images. That's just how many it happened to be. You could do it with fewer. You just need quite a few. So I then created two networks, kind of like the ones I showed you in the example figure, and I trained up classifiers. And the accuracy was very surprising. So it's detecting root tips and root not tips, should we say, root negative, with an accuracy of nearly 98.5%, which is to say that if you give it a random crop of one of these images, it will get it right 98% of the time, which is starting, I think, to move towards the point where we can fully automate RootNav. So, I was pleased. Similarly, with shoots, which are much more varied and there's more target classes that we're looking for, the accuracy is 97.3. You can see that the accuracy of leaf tip is 95 and the others are higher. And actually, I think that's just because, although intuitively leaf tips are perhaps easier for me, I think for a computer they're not, unless we add more data. So we could improve that, I think, by adding more and more input images. But, very, very good classification results. The problem is that we haven't quite solved the problem, because actually all this does is take an input image and classify it. We need to apply this into some tool that we can use. So what we did was we turned it into a localizer by scanning over input images and classifying at every location. So this sliding window here slides over the image, classifies where all of these features are. And that way we can start to build up an idea of where each feature is, rather than just does an image contain them, which of course in some sense we know. So this takes a couple of minutes per image, but the results are quite promising. So these are the results that you might have seen in our bioarchive paper, but also we've just published this in GigaScience. And you can see that, in the roots particularly, it's worked very well. So it finds root tips very accurately, and unlike Harris features, finds almost no root tips along the main length of the root, which of course was a big no-no for me when I was developing a system to work with RootNav. You can see that this is very, very good, but not quite as good. You can see that, for example, here, the awns, the very small awns on this wheat ear have been classified as leaf tip, for example. So we're still working on it, but that's partly because really all we're doing is giving the network this very small area around this image to make a classification. It's still pretty good. And it doesn't, for example, get confused much with this strangely coloured card down here. It seems to, broadly speaking, ignore it, which I think is quite impressive. So I was quite heartened by those results. I thought they were really, really good. But then, so a couple of years ago, people started developing something called fully convolutional networks, which essentially replace the scanning approach with a kind of end-to-end image to image out approach. So essentially we make our network a little bit more complicated, and hopefully we can do all of this in one go. Right? And that gives us extra context as well. It lets us say, well, look, this isn't a leaf tip because it's nowhere near a leaf. Right? And it can make that kind of assertion that it couldn't do when we'd cropped a small area. So what I did instead was I changed my input data to create these kind of slightly odd sausage shapes where I tried to basically label the ears of wheat. So I already had the annotation data from the user, so I basically joined up the base ears and the tips of the ears into these sausage shapes, and then trained a fully convolutional network, which is, as I say, just a slight extension of a normal CNN, and perform pixel-wise classification. And each iteration of this takes less than a second, so it's much, much faster. And you can see that this kind of stuff is working really, really well. So these are input-outputs of a fully convolutional network, which has just been trained to find the whole root system rather than just the tips. And resolution is a concern because some of these things are very, very small compared to a very, very big image. But actually it works really well. And you can see, maybe, I don't know if it's sort of carrying over the web for you, but you can see that the blue ones here are the lateral roots, and the green ones down the bottom, here and here, are primary roots. So it's actually distinguished between lateral roots and primary roots as well, or seminal roots. You'll have to forgive my poor biological terminology. So anyway, it's capable of distinguishing these sort of first order roots from the second order ones, and the seed, and the actual root structure itself. So in some sense, I've accidentally completely replaced RootNav with a much better system, but I suppose I shouldn't complain, even though RootNav took me a long time to develop. So just to work through another few examples. So this was Andy French's system called Roottrace, which will essentially track along these Arabidopsis seedlings over time. And what we didn't have was a way to initialize this process. So traditionally what you would do is you would load this image in and you would click at the start of each plant, and then Roottrace would finish off for you and complete the rest of the annotation. But what we've done is train a neural network, a CNN, to just pick out the tops of each of the plants so that we can automate that process. So, and you can see that that's worked very, very well. And it completely ignores anything odd around the edge of the images, because it just learns to produce features that don't look at those parts of the image, which I think is really, really, really clever. So I have quite a few examples because we've been doing this for a while now. So this is the output of the trained sort of, should we say, sausage shapes I showed you a few slides ago. And you can see that it is successfully picking up wheat ears in fairly cluttered images. It's worth noting that although these plants are in front of a black background, there are images like this one where the majority of the scene is not background and is in fact plant. So to be honest, the amount of plant is really not that important for the effectiveness of these approaches. They seem to work just as well regardless. And one thing we thought was really interesting was, in this image on the right, it's actually learned to ignore the occlusion. So it said, well look, there's wheat ear here and there's wheat ear here, so I'm going to join these two regions up. So that means that this network has managed to infer the position of this ear, despite the fact that it can't see it, which I think is really exciting. And I'm hoping to look into this occlusion a little bit more as we go on. So that was really good. And then we've just kept applying it. So basically, we produce data, and we're essentially happy to seek out other people with data. And this is from confocal microscopy, so we have quite a background in that. I've developed a tool called CellSet that does essentially this, but slower. And this was just me and an intern. We annotated up a few hundred of these cross sections for metaxylem, xylem, and phloem, and you can see that it's basically, this is unseen data, so it's never seen these particular images before. And you can see that it finds the metaxylem, even the ones that are very oddly shaped. So it seems to have learned its way around the natural variability in these lines, which I think is really interesting. And shows it's a much better approach than perhaps my sort of hard-coded low-level features, which I might be able to get working on one of these images, with a long period of time, but it's not going to generalize to these other images. And that's really what we're looking to do. is to have something that can generalize to these images in general rather than specifically this particular one that we tested on. So finally, we've submitted a paper. We're going to see it hopefully at the CVPPP workshop at ITCV, and this is the simultaneous localization of the tips of ears and the spikelets of ears. So we're doing full spikelet counting now. And all I did here was I reframed the question into one of, can we produce, instead of a segmentation output, can we produce a kind of heat map output where we highlight the things we need to count? So this one, this one, this one. It's worked really, really well. And these images are just to show you the kind of broad range of different things it will handle. But it will handle occlusion, and it will handle wheat ears that are rotated 90 degrees, so that there are either single spikelets in a row, or sort of alternating spikelets going down. I had to get an expert biologist to annotate this data, because to be honest, I'm not so familiar with spikelets, so I don't really know how to annotate this data. But they were quite pleased with how it's worked out. And each of these images takes around 100 milliseconds to analyze on our network. So very, very high throughput as well. So that's all very well. Those are basically what I've been looking at, and obviously we're going to be looking at a lot more as we go on. What I wanted to say was, you can get a bit carried away, especially the media, about how good these deep networks are. I mean, they are very, very good, but they're also only good at what you tell them to do. So that's the important thing to remember. They aren't sort of thinking for themselves in any sense. And so I just wanted to show you these pictures here from a really interesting paper that came out a couple of years ago, where they actually trained a deep network to find things like king penguins and starfish and other animals and other everyday objects. And then they trained an algorithm to produce images that completely fooled them. So what's happening in these images are these are fake images that have been passed into the network, and the network has said it's 100% sure they are the thing that it says. So the CNN was 100% sure that this was a king penguin, and it's 100% sure that this is a remote control. Now, in some sense, this doesn't matter, because these things don't occur in everyday life. But it's just interesting to note that they might seem kind of almost like a magical black box, but actually they're learning what we give it. And if we ask silly questions, it won't understand, and it won't learn anything at all. So there has to be a focus on really good data preparation and, accurate annotation, because otherwise we might have a problem. For what it's worth, most of the time when, you're not really trying specifically to fool them, they do work very, very well. A couple of things just to sort of formalize what they can't do. So they don't particularly handle explicit rules about the real world. So for example, there's no way of encoding in a CNN that you're always going to have 3 wheat plants in your images. For example, if that's your imaging setup, you can't always have it find 3, because there's no way of telling it. If you train it with data that only ever contains 3, it might learn that, but you can't guarantee it, and you can't really know. So there are no explicit rules that we can define like we would when we were just doing low-level programming that help us. Right? We haven't developed that yet. They struggle on small data sets. So the smallest data set that I've managed to get it to run on was that Confocal Microscope one, and that was about 200 images. And we had to flip and rotate images to add extra kind of pseudo images. So we're talking hundreds of images at the very least, right? So depending on your problem, that might be easy or hard to produce, right? So you'd have to think about that. And they don't generally apply very well to data that they've not seen before. A human can infer things that they haven't seen. So, for example, just off the top of my head, most of us know a capybara looks a bit like a giant guinea pig, right? So if you said to a child, this is what a guinea pig looked like, could you draw me a picture of a really big one? They probably could. But a CNN can't do anything like that. If you train it on some data and give it some different data, it will do nothing of note, right? So they're very, very specific to their training data as of now. Okay, so just to finish then, what is it that the IPPN can gain from deep networks, apart from perhaps just, good progress in plant phenotyping? I think that the IPPN and other collaborations are very well placed as we start to shift from a focus on techniques like low-level trackers and edge detection and things to just producing lots of varied data sets that can be used to train these networks. We're not quite there yet. They still need quite a lot of expertise to drive them. But we will get to a point where if you have the data, a machine will learn to solve it for you. And it's going to be a case of getting that data. And collaborations are a good place to do this because people have different expertise and, much more manpower. And community-driven schemes where we share trained models and things like this are very useful. So, for example, you might imagine that I share the model that produces my wheat annotations, my wheat spikelet counting, so that other people can use it, or other people can use it to guide their own network into the field, or something like this, right? We move faster as a group if people share models and share architectures and share ideas, rather than, reporting on something they've done and then kind of keeping that model to themselves, right? Because trained models are valuable now, because they let us deploy these systems, but also build new systems on them. So that's something to think about. So I'll finish there. I'm looking at the time; it's not too bad. So I'm quite excited about deep learning. I think that at first I was a bit suspicious of it, and I still am, because it's a black box, and we don't really know what it does a lot of the time. There are people looking inside deep networks, but mixed results so far. But it would be an understatement to say that every task I've given deep networks has been solved so far. They have done everything I've asked of them, and they've done it really, really well. So it is definitely a step change. It's one we have to be careful about, but it's going to be very, very interesting and exciting over the next few years. And hopefully our tools can become less interactive and more generic, so more automated, and more generic to different species and things as we get better data sets. But we do need good data sets and careful development of these systems, right? If you want a deep network that works on both wheat and rice, you're going to need to collect both of those things as your data, because it won't generalize without that. Okay, so that's all. I will leave it there, and any questions would be great.
Thanks, Michael, for this really nice and inspiring talk. So the chat is open for questions. So everybody who is here, could you please key them in or turn on your microphone and just ask something? So currently there's no chats coming in. Mike, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So I do have a few questions.
Sure.
So I'm really intrigued by how well this works and how well also the localization of features works. Yeah. And I'm really pleased to hear that you share your network, the wheat network, because this was one of my first questions, where to get it. So, but could you comment on which software tools you use to implement your network? Because there are so many tools out there and they're changing rapidly, like Keras and all the back ends.
Yeah.
What do you use?
Okay, so my initial experiments were done in something called Caffe, which is fine. The problem with Caffe is that it's perhaps more of a black box than the others. You define your architecture as a file, and then you basically just type in train, and off it goes, and hopefully some results come back at the end. I'm now currently using Torch, which uses a language called Lua to interface with it, but there is a Python version, and Torch is much more open, so you can really get in there and change your data sets around and make sure everything's working just so. So I would say that the best approaches for someone who's really looking to get into this are either Torch or Keras and TensorFlow. Now, Torch is supported by Facebook and Twitter, and TensorFlow is supported predominantly by Google. Now, which is better? I don't think it really matters, to be honest. They're both very, very similar. So my advice would be to use whatever anyone else in your lab is using, so that there's a lot of collaboration. So most of us are using Torch, which is one of the reasons I'm using Torch. if we decided as a group to move to TensorFlow, that would not be a disaster. So at the moment, I'm using Torch, and I think it's really good.
And so, can you, when you train the network, let's say using Torch, can you then copy it to Keras? Is this easily possible?
Usually, yes. There are. I mean, not absolutely trivially. There isn't just a single line of code that will do it, but there are tools to do it, because basically, when it's trained, a neural network is just a huge list of numbers. So as long as you align them correctly, it'll work. So there are programs and software out there to import from one format to another. And indeed, when new architectures in the vision literature come out and new trained models, people are very quick to re-implement them in the other libraries so that everyone else has access to them.
So, thanks a lot for that answer. Then during your talk, I asked myself a lot of times how to decide on the right architecture, how to come up with the right activation function, what kind of pooling. So there are so many different things you can decide on. And how did you do that? What is your approach to selecting the right architecture?
Yeah, so Andy Fench is with me and he's pulling a funny face. Yes, it's a sort of dark art, and there isn't one good answer. Essentially, if you run them along a lot, you'll sort of learn what does and doesn't work. But what I would say is that in recent years, the main development has been ResNets, residual networks, which are essentially combinations of convolution and batch normalization layers. So ResNets are easily found online, and I would focus on those because they're producing the best results. They're also much, much easier to train. The networks that I trained, if I go back a few pages, the networks I trained to perform this took over a day each to learn, whereas my ResNet that I produced this work with took 3 hours to train. So so actually the architecture can make a huge difference on how much data you need and how quickly it learns and how well it learns. So I would recommend any kind of residual architecture where you've got what are essentially skip layers between them to make the training easier. Other than that, most of your consideration has to be to do with your image resolution. If you're trying to put in very, very large images, you need lots of pooling layers to shrink it down as quickly as possible, because otherwise it will become very, very big and won't fit on your graphics card. Yeah. If you're only putting in 32 by 32 images like my roots, you can actually get away with quite small networks, because there's really, it's just not very much, it's not too complicated, would be my advice. So there's a bit of guesswork involved, but I would focus on ResNets as a good place to start.
So, thanks a lot for that comment. So can anybody say, is the chat open for everybody? Because it's open here, but no one keys in a single question to you.
The only thing I'd say is you need to, at the bottom, you need to select all, but other than that, I don't know. Hopefully I just answered all the questions.
So also, as I see a few people having their microphones open, we're happy to take questions orally. No problem by that. So, Michael, do you already have plans for next data sets you want to focus on?
To an extent, yes. So I think I was really pleased with how this week went, obviously, and I was really interested in this particularly here, this section here where it's dealt with the occlusion, because I think that's something that just hasn't been possible before deep networks, because you weren't able to choose image features that would find, should we say, bits of leaf that are actually ear without finding all the other bits of leaf, if that makes sense. It just was impossible. So I think this opens up some really interesting opportunities to see things that we haven't been able to see before in, for example, static cameras. So I'd like to look at that. Early days, of course, and getting the data for that is a little bit tricky. But that's something I'm really interested in. We're also here interested in something called transfer learning, which is where you take a network that already works, let's say in the lab, and we try and apply it out in the field or something like that. So I want to know whether this network architecture here can go out on a tractor and start counting wheat ears in the field. The answer probably is that with some retraining it probably will, but not, should we say, straight out the box. So those, I think, are probably what I'll try and focus on.
So this sounds really interesting. So good luck and keep us updated, please.
Yes, thanks. And if you have data, by all means, we're always interested in collaborations and things because I think that it's really exciting time.
So collaboration I think is the thing to do here. And thanks for offering and being so open. By the way, we'll see each other, and I hope many of the people being online here on CPPP in October in Venice.
Great.
And so I'm really looking forward to see you all there. And thanks again, Michael, for this really, really inspiring talk. I learned quite a lot. So thank you again, and
you're very welcome.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.